A billionaire came home unannounced, stepping into the life he had carefully constructed from afar. He froze in the doorway, his world shattering at the sight of the black maid cradling his daughter with a tenderness he himself had never shown. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith's footsteps echoed through the marble hallway of his Palo Alto mansion, each step amplifying the emptiness that had become his constant companion. The house, once filled with his wife's laughter, now felt cavernous and cold, despite its $20 million price tag. He loosened his silk tie, exhausted from the drive back from San Francisco, where a minor earthquake had abruptly cancelled his investor meeting. At least I can spend some time with Emily, he thought, though the idea brought more anxiety than comfort. Since becoming a widower, 18 months ago, he'd struggled to connect with his daughter, finding refuge instead in 16-hour workdays and conference calls. The mansion was unusually quiet. Normally, he'd hear the nanny's voice or the clatter of the cook preparing dinner. John checked his watch, 3:30 in the afternoon, hours before his expected return. The staff wouldn't be prepared for his early arrival. As he climbed the grand staircase toward the east wing, the faint sound of splashing water and a gentle humming caught his attention. Following the noise, he approached the bathroom adjacent to Emily's bedroom. The door slightly ajar. Steam billowed out in warm clouds, carrying the scent of lavender baby soap. John pushed the door open and froze at the threshold. Mary Johnson, the quiet black maid he'd hired just 3 months prior, knelt beside the porcelain bath. Her uniform sleeves were rolled up as she gently washed Emily's dark curls. His 2-year-old daughter giggled, splashing tiny hands in the water while Mary sang softly, her voice tender and maternal. "What are you doing?" The words escaped John's mouth before he could process the scene fully. His voice echoed harshly against the marble tiles. Mary jumped, turning toward him with wide eyes. "Mr. Smith, I didn't expect. Where is Miss Patterson?" he demanded, referring to the professional nanny he paid handsomely to care for Emily. "She had a doctor's appointment, sir. She asked if I could—" "This is completely inappropriate," John cut her off, his face flushing with anger. The sight of this woman, a maid he barely knew, bathing his daughter stirred something primal and defensive within him. "You were hired to clean, not to care for my child." Emily's smile vanished, her bottom lip beginning to tremble. "You're fired," John said coldly, the words slicing through the warm air. "Pack your things and be out by tonight." Mary's expression remained dignified despite the shock in her eyes. She carefully lifted Emily from the tub, wrapping her in a fluffy towel before standing to face the billionaire. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the injustice. "I'll be gone within the hour." Emily's screams filled the mansion, echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings. Her tiny fists pounded against John Smith's chest as he tried to pull her away from Mary. "Mama Mary, Mama Mary," she wailed, her face flushed crimson with distress. Those 2 words, so innocent from a child's lips, struck John like physical blows. The billionaire stood frozen, his daughter's cries exposing the truth he'd been avoiding. In his grief and business pursuits, he had become a stranger to his own child. Emily didn't reach for him in her moment of fear, she reached for the maid. Mary Johnson's face remained composed despite the chaos, a careful mask of dignity covering her pain. Her dark eyes glistened with unshed tears that refused to fall. "I understand, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands as she began gathering her belongings. "I'll be out within the hour," Mary added, carefully extracting herself from Emily's desperate grip. The toddler's sobs intensified, her little body heaving with grief as she tried to follow her caretaker. "No go, no go," Emily pleaded, clinging to Mary's skirt. The maid knelt down, gently wiping tears from the child's flushed cheeks. "I have to go now, sweet girl," Mary whispered, her composure finally cracking as her voice caught on the last word. John watched the interaction, a strange hollowness expanding in his chest. He'd never seen his daughter so distraught, not even after her mother's funeral. The realization was a knife to his heart. Emily had found maternal comfort in Mary, while he remained distant, buried in work and grief. Unable to bear the weight of his daughter's anguish or Mary's quiet dignity, John retreated to his office. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a soft click, that somehow felt more final than a slam. He sank into his leather chair, hands shaking as he poured himself a drink. Through the walls of his Palo Alto mansion, Emily's heartbroken wails continued. John covered his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his very bones. He'd fired staff before without a second thought. Why did this feel so different, so devastating? Hours later, long after Mary had left and Emily had cried herself to exhaustion, the mansion fell into an unnatural silence. John sat alone in his darkened office, the untouched drink still in his hand, haunted by the echo of his daughter calling another woman Mama, and the realization of just how much of a stranger he had become in his own home. That night, as darkness settled over the mansion, John Smith couldn't sleep. The vast master bedroom felt hollow and accusatory, each tick of the antique clock on the wall marking another moment of his daughter's heartbreak. Guilt gnawed at him like a physical presence, his mind replaying the scene in an endless loop. Emily's tiny arms reaching desperately not for him, but for Mary. From down the hall, Emily's sobs continued unabated, rising and falling in waves that pierced the silence. 3 hours had passed since Mary's departure, yet his daughter's grief showed no signs of subsiding. The nanny he'd hastily called in as a replacement stood helplessly in the doorway of Emily's room, her inexperience evident in her panicked expression. "I've tried everything, Miss Smith," she whispered when John emerged from his office. "She won't stop asking for Miss Johnson." John ran his hands through his disheveled hair, the weight of his impulsive decision crushing him. The mansion, usually a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison of his own making. He paced the hallway, each of Emily's cries cutting deeper than the last. At midnight he reached for his smartphone. Pride warred with desperation as he scrolled to Mary's contact. His thumb hovered over her name for several agonizing seconds before he pressed call, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mary," he said when she answered, his voice raw with emotion. "I need you to come back, just for tonight." The words felt like glass in his throat. "Please." Emily won't stop crying. The silence on the other end stretched painfully before Mary's quiet voice replied, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived, her eyes were rimmed with red, but her posture remained dignified. John couldn't meet her gaze as he led her upstairs, shame burning in his chest. The moment Emily spotted Mary from her crib, her sobs transformed into hiccuping gasps of relief, her little arms stretching upward in desperate yearning. Mary hesitated at the threshold, looking to John for permission. He nodded once, swallowing hard. "Mama," Emily cried, the word both a knife and a revelation. The black woman moved to the crib with gentle purpose, lifting Emily with practiced ease. The toddler immediately buried her face in Mary's neck, her small body still trembling with aftershocks of grief. "I'm here now," Mary whispered, rocking Emily slowly. "I'm here." John backed away, an outsider in his daughter's emotional world. As he retreated to his office, the sound of Emily's breathing finally evening out into sleep followed him down the hallway, a painful reminder of what his wealth couldn't buy and what Mary Johnson provided without effort. Mary Johnson's fingers moved with practiced tenderness across Emily's forehead, her touch cool against the child's warm skin. The little girl had finally stopped crying, her tears replaced by occasional hiccups as she nestled against Mary's chest. The maid hummed a melody, something sweet and unfamiliar, that seemed to chase away the shadows lingering in the corners of the mansion. John stood frozen in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as if to steady himself. He watched as his daughter's small fingers curled around Mary's wrist, holding on with complete trust. The scene before him felt intimate, almost sacred, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding. "Is she asleep?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mary looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Almost," she replied softly. "She's fighting it, though. She's afraid I'll leave if she closes her eyes." The words struck John like a physical blow. He took a tentative step into the room, then another, until he stood beside the rocking chair where Mary cradled Emily. His daughter's eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, but stubbornly resisting sleep. "I'll stay right here," Mary promised Emily, her voice a gentle murmur, "just like the moon stays in the sky all night." Emily's breathing gradually deepened, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of slumber. The lullaby continued, filling the cavernous bedroom with warmth that John hadn't felt since his wife's passing. He realized with a start that he'd forgotten what comfort sounded like. "Who taught you that song?" he asked, lowering himself onto the edge of Emily's bed. "My grandmother," Mary answered, her fingers still stroking Emily's hair. "She sang it to me and all my cousins." John nodded, suddenly aware of how little he knew about this woman who had become the center of his daughter's world. She'd worked in his home for nearly a year, yet he couldn't recall a single conversation that hadn't been about schedules or household matters. As Emily finally surrendered to sleep, Mary carefully laid her in the bed, tucking the blankets around her with movements so tender they made John's throat tighten. The mansion, once his fortress against grief, now felt painfully fragile, its foundations shifting beneath him. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but sincere, "for staying tonight." Mary straightened, smoothing her uniform with dignity. "She needs consistency," she said simply. "Children do." John watched as she moved toward the door, her shadow stretching across the room. In that moment, he understood that the walls he'd built around himself and Emily weren't keeping pain out, they were trapping it inside. The call came at 7 in the morning, interrupting John Smith's breakfast. He recognized the voice of Thompson, Emily's official nanny, immediately strained and tearful. Her mother had suffered a severe stroke in Boston. She needed to leave immediately and wouldn't return for weeks, possibly months. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Smith," she sobbed through the phone. "I know this puts you in a terrible position." John ended the call and stared blankly at his untouched coffee. The timing couldn't have been worse. With 3 major acquisitions pending and the board meeting next week, he had no time to interview new nannies. His gaze drifted to the kitchen doorway where Mary Johnson stood, her expression carefully neutral as she waited for instructions. "It seems you're all we have now," he said, the admission tasting bitter on his tongue. Mary nodded once, her composure unwavering. "Emily will be fine, sir, I promise." Throughout the morning, John watched from his office doorway as Mary moved through the mansion with quiet efficiency. She prepared Emily's breakfast, cutting the toast into star shapes that made the child giggle, something John had never seen Miss Thompson do. When Emily spilled her juice, there were no harsh words, just gentle hands cleaning up, and a soft voice reassuring the anxious toddler. "Not bad, Mary," Frank whispered as he passed her in the hallway. The elderly butler gave her an encouraging smile before continuing with his duties. By noon, John found himself torn between relief and resentment. His conference calls were uninterrupted, his schedule intact, yet something gnawed at him each time he heard Emily's delighted laughter echoing down the corridor. The sound was so foreign in these halls that had known mostly silence since his wife's passing. When he ventured into the sunroom during a break, he found Mary sitting cross-legged on the floor with Emily, building a tower of colorful blocks. His daughter looked up, her face brightening. "Dad, look what me and Mama Mary made." The words struck him like a physical blow. He nodded stiffly, retreating to his office, where he could breathe again. Later, as he signed documents requiring urgent attention, John caught himself listening for sounds from elsewhere in the house. The mansion felt different somehow, warmer, less like the mausoleum it had become. His authority felt undermined, his control slipping, yet his daughter was finally smiling again. He picked up his phone to call his mother, then set it down again. Eleanor would only make things worse with her judgments and demands. For now he would watch and wait, uncomfortable in the knowledge that Mary Johnson had become indispensable. The whispers began in the kitchen, hushed conversations that fell silent whenever Mary Johnson entered the room. The staff, who had initially welcomed her, now eyed her with suspicion as Emily's attachment to her grew more evident each day. "She's overstepping," the cook muttered to the gardener one morning, slicing vegetables with unnecessary force. "That woman's trying to replace Mrs. Smith, mark my words." The rumors spread through the mansion like an invisible current. Mary's genuine affection for Emily was twisted into something calculated and sinister. Staff members who once smiled at her now avoided eye contact in the hallways. The cook, a woman who had served the Smith family for 7 years, took her resentment further. She accidentally misplaced Mary's carefully prepared lunch for Emily. Later that week, she neglected to mention an important dietary restriction when Mary was planning the child's meal. "I'm sorry," she said with false sweetness when confronted. "I must have forgotten to tell you." Mary noticed how her cleaning supplies would mysteriously disappear, or how the laundry she'd folded would be subtly disturbed. Small acts of sabotage designed to make her look incompetent in John's eyes. Yet through it all, Mary maintained her composure. She double-checked Emily's meals, kept extra supplies hidden in her quarters, and continued her duties with unwavering dedication. Her silent dignity became her armor, her love for Emily her shield. One evening, as Mary sat alone on the service stairs after putting Emily to bed, Frank Brown found her. The elderly butler lowered himself beside her with a soft groan, his knees protesting after decades of service. "They treated my Sarah the same way when she first came," he said quietly, referring to his late wife. "People fear what they don't understand." Mary looked up, surprised by the unexpected alliance. "I see how you care for that child," Frank continued, his weathered face softening. "Reminds me of how my wife was with our James before we lost him." The mention of his deceased son hung in the air between them. Frank rarely spoke of this loss, but in Mary's gentle care for Emily, he recognized something that transcended job titles and social boundaries. "Thank you," Mary whispered, the simple acknowledgement warming her more than any elaborate gesture could have. Frank nodded, patting her hand before rising to his feet. "This house needs more love than protocol, Miss Johnson. Always has." As he walked away, Mary felt something shift inside her. In this mansion of whispers and wealth, she had found an unexpected ally and the strength to weather the growing storm. The sleek black luxury car pulled into the circular driveway with a crunch of gravel that made Mary Johnson's heart sink. She recognized the vehicle immediately. Eleanor Smith had arrived, unannounced and unwelcome. John froze when he saw his mother stepping out of the car, her Hermes scarf fluttering in the breeze. Eleanor's eyes swept critically over the mansion's exterior before fixing Mary with a glacial stare through the window. "Mother," John said stiffly as he greeted her at the door, "this is unexpected." Eleanor barely acknowledged him, handing her designer coat to Frank Brown without a glance. The elderly butler offered Mary a sympathetic look as he disappeared with the garment. "We need to talk," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the authority of old money and entitlement. She guided her son toward his office with a firm hand on his elbow, leaving Mary standing awkwardly in the hallway. Behind the closed door, Eleanor's voice rose sharply. "Have you lost your mind? The board members are talking, John. Everyone knows you've kept that woman here." Mary busied herself with Emily, trying not to hear the heated conversation, but Eleanor's words carried through the mansion's halls. "If you keep that woman here, you risk everything: your reputation, your company, your daughter." The matriarch's voice was cutting. What would Caroline think if she could see this? The mention of his late wife made John's response inaudible, but the tension vibrated through the house. That evening, Eleanor insisted on hosting an impromptu dinner party, summoning several family friends and business associates. Mary understood the message. She was being put on display, evaluated, judged. Throughout dinner, Eleanor directed pointed questions at the maid whenever she entered the dining room. "Where exactly did you train for childcare? Which agency verified your background?" Each question dripped with suspicion. Mary answered with quiet dignity, her spine straight as steel. "I completed 3 years of nursing school before family circumstances required me to leave, Mrs. Smith." Eleanor's eyebrow arched. Family circumstances? How convenient. The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably, wine glasses half raised, watching the power struggle unfold. Then came the moment that changed everything. Emily, brought in to say goodnight to her father, spotted Mary and lunged from Frank's arms. "Mama Mary," she cried joyfully, her little arms outstretched. The room fell silent. Forks hovered midair. Eleanor's face hardened into marble as her granddaughter clung to the black maid with absolute trust and affection. John looked from his daughter to his mother, something resolute forming in his expression. For the first time since his wife's death, he seemed truly present in the room and in his daughter's life. Eleanor Smith's ultimatum came over breakfast, her voice as cold as the silver spoon she tapped against fine china. "If you insist on keeping that woman in this house, John, I'll have no choice but to reconsider your position in the family finances. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, the gesture precise and threatening. John stared at his mother, feeling like a child again, despite being worth billions in his own right. The family trust still held substantial leverage over his company's future expansions. He pushed his untouched eggs away. Emily needs stability right now, he argued, his voice lower than intended. What that child needs is proper care, not some woman with questionable background playing mother. Eleanor's words sliced through the morning air. Later that day, 3 board members called with concerns about John's domestic situation. The coincidence wasn't lost on him. His mother's social network had always been her most effective weapon. The markets are sensitive, one investor reminded him. Personal scandals affect stock prices. John paced his office, trapped between his daughter's needs and the empire he'd built. Through the window he could see Mary pushing Emily on the garden swing, their laughter floating upward like a rebuke to his indecision. Meanwhile, across town, the employment agency that had placed Mary in the Smith household received an anonymous call questioning her credentials. The agency director, nervous about losing the prestigious Smith account, immediately launched an investigation. "We need to review all her paperwork," the director told her assistant. "Pull everything we have on Mary Johnson." By afternoon, Mary's employment file had been flagged for irregularities. Papers that had been properly filed months ago were suddenly missing. Her background check, previously cleared, was subjected to additional scrutiny. Frank found Mary in the kitchen that evening, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared Emily's dinner. "Agency called," she said quietly. "They're claiming some documents are missing from my file." The elderly butler's eyes narrowed. "Convenient timing," he observed, glancing toward the wing where Eleanor had taken residence. Mary nodded, understanding the unspoken. "They've scheduled a review meeting tomorrow. If I can't provide additional verification..." She left the sentence unfinished. Frank placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "I've worked for this family for 30 years. I've seen how they operate when they feel threatened. I'm just trying to do my job," Mary whispered. "That's precisely what worries them," Frank replied. "You're doing it too well." That night, as Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Mary sat at her small desk, staring at her phone. One call to the agency could end this nightmare, but it would mean revealing the very past she'd fought so hard to escape. Frank Brown stood by the kitchen window, his weathered hands carefully polishing the silver that had been in the Smith family for generations. He watched as Mary Johnson moved through the garden with Emily, the little girl's laughter floating through the open window like music. "She's different with you," Frank said when Mary returned. Emily finally napping upstairs. "I've seen many nannies come and go in this house, but none of them connected with her like you have." Mary set down the laundry basket she was carrying, her shoulders tense with the weight of recent events. "Mr. Smith doesn't see it that way. He thinks I'm overstepping." The elderly butler's eyes crinkled with kindness. "Emily started calling you Mama long before anyone noticed," he revealed quietly. "I heard her months ago when you were reading to her in the library." She whispered it then, testing the word like a secret. Mary's hands trembled slightly as she folded a small dress. The confession both warmed and troubled her heart. The depth of Emily's attachment was beautiful but dangerous, for both of them. "The little one knows what she needs," Frank continued, setting aside a polished serving spoon. "Children always do." That evening, as twilight settled over the mansion, Mary found Frank alone on the servants' porch. Something about his steady presence invited confidence. Before she realized it, words she'd kept locked away came tumbling out. "I was in my 2nd year of nursing school," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Top of my class. Then my brother Marcus got sick. Leukemia. No parents, just us. I dropped everything to care for him." Frank listened silently as Mary described the 18 months she'd spent as her brother's caretaker, administering medications, tracking symptoms, fighting insurance companies, and ultimately holding his hand as he slipped away. "I never went back," she admitted. "Couldn't face those hospital halls again. But I still remember everything I learned." She smiled faintly. "That's how I knew what to do when Emily had that fever last month." Frank nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's why you're so good with her. You've done this before." "I've never told anyone here," Mary said. "Especially not John. He'd just see it as another reason not to trust me, a half-trained nurse who couldn't even save her own brother." The butler placed his hand gently over hers. "Some wounds heal others even when they haven't healed themselves," he said softly. "That's what you're doing for Emily. And maybe someday for her father too." The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between Mary Johnson's personal items in the staff quarters. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, eyes widening at the words scrawled in angry black ink. "We know who you really are. Leave now before everyone else finds out too." Mary crumpled the note, heart pounding against her ribs. She'd been careful, so careful to leave no traces of her past, yet someone had found her anyway. Over the next week, 3 more letters appeared under her pillow, in her coat pocket, inside her personal notebook. Each message more threatening than the last, each one dredging up fears she thought she'd buried. The mansion's atmosphere grew thick with tension. Staff members whispered in corners, conversations abruptly halting when Mary entered rooms. She felt invisible lines being drawn, dividing the household between those who trusted her and those who did. Only Frank offered silent support, his weathered face creased with concern whenever their paths crossed. "Someone's trying to scare you off," the elderly butler murmured one evening, after finding Mary staring blankly at the latest note. "Don't let them win." But the fear was taking its toll. Mary's hands shook slightly when bathing Emily. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes during story time. She found herself checking over her shoulder, jumping at small noises, wondering which staff member harbored such hatred toward her. Emily, sensitive beyond her 2 years, sensed the change. The little girl became increasingly clingy, refusing to let Mary out of her sight even for moments. Her nightmares returned, leaving her sobbing in the darkness until Mary came running. One evening, as Mary tucked her into bed, Emily clutched her sleeve with surprising strength. "Will Mama Mary leave me too?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. "Like my real mummy did." The innocent question hung in the air between them. Mary froze, tears threatening to spill over. From the doorway came a sharp intake of breath. John Smith stood there, face ashen, having heard his daughter's words. For a moment, their eyes met over Emily's head, Mary's filled with helpless compassion, John's with raw pain. "I'm not going anywhere," Mary whispered to Emily, though uncertainty gnawed at her insides. Later that night, John sat alone in his office, Emily's question echoing in his mind. The emptiness he'd carried since his wife's death suddenly felt unbearable. He'd built walls around his heart, around this house, yet somehow Mary had slipped through them, becoming essential to his daughter in ways he'd failed to be. The realization shattered something inside him, pride perhaps, or the illusion that grief could be contained by wealth and distance. What began as petty incidents now evolved into something far more sinister. Mary Johnson found her personal items moved around her quarters, drawers left open, and clothing disturbed. She said nothing, simply reorganizing with quiet dignity, unwilling to cause further tension in the household. One morning, Mary took a sip of her coffee and immediately spat it out. The bitter, chemical taste burned her tongue. She stared at the cup, hands trembling slightly as she realized someone had deliberately tampered with her drink. Frank Brown noticed Mary's distress from across the kitchen. The elderly butler approached, concern etched in the lines of his weathered face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low enough that the cook couldn't hear. Later that evening, Frank caught the cook and another staff member ransacking Mary's room. "I've worked in this house for 25 years, he said firmly, blocking the doorway. "Mr. Smith will hear about this immediately." True to his word, Frank reported the incident to John. The businessman sat in his office, fingers pressed against his temples as the butler detailed the escalating hostility toward Mary. "They're saying terrible things about her, sir," Frank explained, "claiming she's trying to replace your late wife, that she's manipulating Emily for financial gain." John stared at the framed photo on his desk. Emily's second birthday, the child's smile bright, but his own eyes distant. "And what do you think, Frank?" The butler straightened his shoulders. "I think Mary is the best thing that's happened to this household since we lost Mrs. Smith. And I think you know that too, sir." That night, John found himself standing outside Emily's room, watching as Mary sang his daughter to sleep. The gentle melody filled the hallway, somehow making the massive mansion feel like a home again. For the first time since his wife's death, the emptiness in his chest felt less crushing. When Mary emerged from the bedroom, John cleared his throat. "I've fired the staff members responsible," he said quietly. "Frank told me everything." Mary nodded, her expression guarded. "Thank you. I've been fighting the wrong battles," John admitted, the words difficult but necessary, trying to maintain control instead of... He trailed off, unable to articulate the realization forming in his heart. Instead of healing, Mary finished for him. John looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. Not as the maid, not as a threat to his authority, but as the woman who had somehow become essential to both his daughter's happiness and his own possibility of moving forward. "Yes," he said simply. Instead of healing, the crystal glasses clinked as John Smith's business associates mingled in the grand foyer of his Palo Alto mansion. These dinner parties had become a necessary evil to maintain appearances, though John found himself constantly checking his watch, eager for the evening to end. Upstairs, Emily had refused to sleep, her tiny body racked with a sudden fever. Mary Johnson moved with practiced ease, placing a cool cloth on the child's forehead while humming a gentle lullaby. When Emily finally drifted off, Mary gathered her close, rocking her with maternal tenderness. Neither noticed the flash from the garden window. A kitchen assistant, bitter after being reprimanded by Frank earlier that day, had tipped off a local paparazzo about the unusual arrangement in the billionaire's home. The photographer captured the intimate moment, Mary cradling Emily, their foreheads touching, the black woman's lips pressed against the white child's temple. By morning the damage was done. "Billionaire's secret, who's raising the Smith heiress?" screamed one headline. "Nanny or new mom?" questioned another, with carefully edited photos, suggesting impropriety where there was only love. John's smartphone buzzed incessantly. First came the concerned board members, then nervous investors questioning his judgment. Eleanor called 6 times, each voicemail more scathing than the last. "This is exactly what I warned you about," his mother hissed in her final message. "Your reputation is everything in this world." Mary found the newspaper on the kitchen counter. Her hands trembled as she read the vicious implications beneath the photos. When John entered, she was already packing her small suitcase. "I should leave," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "This will only get worse. For all of us." John crossed the room in 3 strides, his normally composed demeanor cracking. He took the suitcase from her hands and set it aside. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "You are the only one holding this family together." Mary finally looked up, tears brimming. "They'll destroy you. Your company. Let them try." The businessman who had built an empire through calculated decisions was nowhere to be found. Instead, there stood a father who had finally recognized what truly mattered. "I've spent 2 years hiding from my daughter because she reminds me of what I lost," John admitted, vulnerability etching lines around his eyes. "You've shown more courage facing your past than I ever have." Outside, another photographer lurked in the garden. Inside, for the first time since his wife's death, Jan Smith chose family over fortune. Eleanor cornered Mary in the mansion's garden, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft earth as she approached. The older woman's face was a mask of cold determination, her pearl necklace catching the afternoon sunlight. "Let's be honest with each other," Eleanor Smith said, her voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. "What exactly is your endgame here? The devoted caretaker act might fool my son, but I recognize an opportunist when I see one." Mary Johnson continued pruning the roses, her movements deliberate and calm despite the accusation hanging in the air. She finally straightened, meeting Eleanor's gaze direct. "With all due respect, Mrs. Smith, you're looking for something that isn't there," Mary replied, her voice steady but firm. "I don't want your world. I want Emily to feel safe. That's all." Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand gripped her handbag tighter. "Do you expect me to believe you have no interest in my son's fortune?" A single black woman with mysterious origins suddenly becoming indispensable to a billionaire and his daughter. "What I expect," Mary said, removing her gardening gloves, "is the chance to do my job without being treated like a thief." Emily deserves stability, not suspicion. The matriarch's eyes narrowed, but something in Mary's unwavering dignity gave her pause. Without another word, Eleanor turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Mary alone among the half-pruned roses. Later that night, John sat in his office, the mansion quiet except for the occasional creak of the old structure settling. He pulled open his desk drawer and removed a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a letter, the paper now slightly yellowed, addressed to him in his late wife's handwriting. His fingers trembled as he unfolded. As he read her final words, hopes for Emily's future, her fears about leaving them both, a familiar scent seemed to fill the room. Lavender, his wife's favorite. "Take care of our little girl," she had written. "Don't let your grief become hers." John's vision blurred with tears. For 2 years he'd been doing exactly what she'd feared, keeping Emily at arm's length, protecting himself from the pain of attachment, from seeing his wife's eyes looking back at him from their daughter's face. He'd been so focused on preserving Emily's material future that he'd neglected her emotional present. And it had taken Mary, a stranger, who'd become so much more, to show him what his daughter truly needed. John wiped his eyes, carefully refolded the letter, and placed it back in the box. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would begin to be the father Emily deserved. The weight of secrets had begun to press on Mary's shoulders. After the confrontation with Eleanor and the paparazzi incident, she found herself pacing the mansion's corridors late one night, her heart heavy with unspoken truths. When she passed John's office and saw light spilling from beneath the door, she knew it was time. John Smith looked up from his desk, surprised to find Mary standing in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. Something in her expression made him set aside his work immediately. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you long ago." The billionaire gestured to the chair across from him, concern etching lines around his eyes. As Mary settled into the seat, she took a deep breath. "My name isn't Mary Johnson," she confessed, her eyes meeting his direct. "I changed it 3 years ago to escape my ex-husband. Her voice faltered. "He nearly killed me the last time I tried to leave." John sat perfectly still, absorbing her words as she detailed the violence she'd endured, the hospital stays she'd explained away, and finally her desperate escape in the middle of the night with nothing but a small bag of belongings. "I needed to disappear completely," Mary explained. "The agency helped me with new paperwork. I've been looking over my shoulder ever since." Instead of the anger or betrayal she'd feared, John's face softened. "Is that why you're so good with Emily's nightmares? You've lived with fear too?" Mary nodded, tears finally breaking free. "I understand what it means to need someone to make you feel safe." To her astonishment, John rose and came around the desk. "This mansion has security systems most banks would envy," he said quietly. "You're safe here, both of you." In the days that followed, something shifted in the grand house. Frank noticed it first, fresh flowers appearing in rooms long neglected, music drifting from the kitchen where silence had reigned. Emily's laughter, once rare and tentative, now echoed through hallways as she chased her father through the garden. Mary, freed from the weight of her secret, moved through the mansion with new confidence. One afternoon, John found her teaching Emily to bake cookies, flour dusting both their cheeks. He paused in the doorway, struck by the simple joy before him. "Stay," he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as Mary. "Not just for Emily, for all of us." The walls that had once seemed to absorb all warmth now seemed to radiate it back, as if the mansion itself was coming alive with second chances. The storm had been brewing all day, dark clouds gathering over Palo Alto like an omen. When the power finally cut out, plunging the mansion into darkness, Mary Johnson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had lived with fear long enough to recognize its presence. Emily clung to her leg, whimpering at the sudden dark. "It's okay, sweetheart," Mary whispered, lifting the child into her arms. "Just a little adventure, that's all." She was reaching for the flashlight in the kitchen drawer when she heard it. The faint click of the garden door. Mary froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The staff had gone home hours ago. John was working late. They were alone. "Is that Daddy?" Emily asked, her small voice piercing the silence. Mary pressed a finger to the child's lips. "Let's play a quiet game," she murmured, moving swiftly toward the pantry. She placed Emily inside, behind bags of flour and sugar. "Stay here like hide and seek. Don't come out until I call for you." The little girl's eyes widened with uncertainty, but she nodded, trusting Mary completely. Closing the pantry door, Mary grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan from the counter. The footsteps were closer now, deliberate and unhurried. She recognized the pattern, the slight drag of the left foot, the result of an injury she'd once tended to herself. "I know you're here, Mariam," a voice called, using her real name like a weapon. "Did you think changing your name would keep you hidden forever?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen for a split second. In that moment, she saw him, the man who had once promised to love her, then nearly destroyed her. His face was harder now, etched with hatred and prison time. Mary backed away, keeping herself between the intruder and the pantry where Emily hid. "This isn't my home," she said steadily. "There are security systems, people who will come, in this storm, with no power." He laughed, advancing. "No one's coming." When he lunged, Mary swung the pan with all her strength. The sickening thud was followed by a crash as he stumbled into the island counter. But he wasn't down, just angrier. The next moments were a blur of struggle and pain. Mary fought with the ferocity of someone protecting not just herself, but the child she'd come to love as her own. When John Smith burst through the door with Frank Brown and 2 security guards, they found Mary bloodied but standing, the intruder unconscious at her feet. As police led the man away in handcuffs, John looked at Mary with new understanding. Her secret past lay exposed, but so did her extraordinary courage. She hadn't just been a caretaker to Emily, she had become a shield willing to sacrifice everything. "You could have run," John said quietly, watching the paramedic clean a cut above her eye. Mary glanced toward Emily, now safe in Frank's gentle care. "No," she replied. "I couldn't." The rumors spread through Palo Alto like wildfire. John Smith's smartphone buzzed incessantly with calls from board members, investors, and business partners demanding explanations. The photographs of Mary with Emily had been twisted by tabloids into scandalous headlines questioning his judgment and her intentions. "You need to distance yourself from this situation immediately," his chief financial officer advised during an emergency conference call. "The markets are responding negatively. 3 major investors are threatening to pull out." John sat in his office, staring at the framed photo of Emily on his desk. The little girl was smiling, truly smiling for the first time since her mother's death. Mary stood beside her, their hands intertwined. "I won't do it," he said, ending the call abruptly. That evening, as Mary tucked Emily into bed, John made a decision that shocked everyone. He began writing a memoir, documenting the truth about the remarkable woman who had saved not just his daughter but himself. He wrote through the night, pouring out the story of Mary's courage in escaping her violent past, her selfless protection of Emily, and the healing she had brought to their broken home. "You can't publish this," Eleanor warned when she discovered the manuscript. "Think of what people will say. Think of the company." "I've spent my entire life thinking about what others would say," John replied. "For once I'm thinking about what matters." The memoir was released against the advice of his publicist, legal team, and family. The backlash was swift and severe. 2 board positions he had held for years were withdrawn. A major deal fell through. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Yet for every door that closed, unexpected windows opened. Letters poured in from people touched by the story. Parents who had found healing through caregivers. Children raised by those not bound by blood. Frank found John in the garden one afternoon, reading these messages with tears in his eyes. "You've lost a great deal," the elderly butler observed. "And gained so much more," John replied. At a shareholders' meeting, when challenged about his choices, John stood firm. "I've built my fortune by controlling everything around me," he told the room. "But I've learned that some things, the most important things, can't be controlled, only cherished." For the first time in his life, the billionaire who had everything discovered what it meant to be truly rich. Connection had replaced control, and despite the professional consequences, John had never felt more certain of any decision. Mary Johnson stood at the podium of the Palo Alto Women's Shelter, her fingers gripping the edges as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. The small auditorium was packed. Women of all backgrounds leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on her face. 3 weeks ago, when the shelter director had called to invite her to speak about resilience, Mary had nearly refused. Now, with John and Emily watching from the front row, she found her courage. "My journey began with running," she started, her voice barely audible before gaining strength. "Running from violence, from fear, even from my own name." The room fell silent as she shared fragments of her past, the abandoned nursing school dreams, her brother's illness, the relationship that had nearly destroyed her. "I found myself in a mansion, caring for a child who needed love as desperately as I needed safety," Mary continued, carefully avoiding specific details that might identify her employers. "And when that little girl called me Mama, I realized that family isn't always about blood." In the front row, Emily squirmed on John's lap, pointing excitedly whenever Mary looked their way. The businessman held his daughter close, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, a recognition of how close he'd come to losing them both. Mary spoke of identity and belonging, of finding strength in unexpected places. "Sometimes," she said, meeting the eyes of a young woman clutching a tissue in the second row, "the family you build saves you more than the one you were born into." When she described the night of fear during the home invasion, several women nodded in silent understanding. The caretaker didn't mention her ex by name, but spoke of the moment she'd chosen to protect rather than flee. "Because love makes us braver than we ever thought possible." As Mary concluded her speech, the shelter erupted in applause. Women approached her afterward, some sharing their own stories in hurried whispers, others simply squeezing her hand in solidarity. The director presented her with a small plaque commemorating her courage. "You've given hope to women who thought they'd lost everything," the director said, embracing Mary warmly. Later, as they walked to the vehicle parked outside, Emily reached for Mary's hand. "You were so brave, Mama Mary," the child said, her eyes wide with admiration. John placed his hand gently on Mary's shoulder. "You silenced every rumor today," he said quietly. "Not with denial, but with truth." Mary smiled, feeling a weight lifting that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time since entering the Smith household, she walked not as someone hiding, but as someone finally seen. Frank Brown knelt in the soft earth, his weathered hands working the soil with practiced care. The garden, once a showcase of the Smith estate, had fallen into neglect after the death of John's wife. Now it was becoming a sanctuary, a place where healing took root alongside the flowers. "My daughter loved hydrangeas," Frank said quietly, handing Mary Johnson a small plant. She would have been 43 this year. Mary paused, soil darkening her fingertips. "I didn't know you had a daughter." "Leukemia took her when she was 9, the elderly butler replied, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. "That's why I understood from the beginning what you were doing for Emily. Some bonds transcend what others can see." They worked side by side, transforming the forgotten corner of the mansion grounds. Mary found peace in the rhythm of gardening, digging, planting, watering, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined her life before. Frank shared stories of his daughter, releasing decades of carefully guarded grief with each seed they planted. "When you lose someone," Frank said, "people expect you to move on eventually. But you don't move on, you move forward, carrying them with you." Mary nodded, understanding all too well. "That's what I've been trying to help John see about Emily's mother. She can be present even in absence." From her second-floor window, Eleanor Smith watched the unlikely pair working in the garden. She had arrived intending to reclaim her influence over her son's household, but something unexpected had happened. Day after day, she observed Mary, her quiet strength, her unwavering dedication to Emily, her refusal to be diminished by Eleanor's cold reception. It reminded Eleanor of herself, decades ago, before society's expectations had hardened her. Before she'd learned to value status over connection. The next morning, Eleanor did something that surprised even herself. She left a small package outside Mary's door, a rare book on garden design she'd found in the library, with a simple note, "For your project with Frank." Later that day, when Mary thanked her, Eleanor merely nodded, unwilling to acknowledge the softening she felt. But when Emily ran into the room, dirt on her small hands from helping in the garden, Eleanor didn't flinch or scold. Instead, she knelt down and asked her granddaughter what she had planted. The garden bloomed under Mary and Frank's care, roses climbing trellises, lavender scenting the air, wildflowers dancing in the breeze. Like the people tending it, the garden was finding its way back to life, one careful planting at a time. Emily's laughter echoed through the mansion's corridors, a sound that had once been as rare as rainfall in a desert. The little girl who had previously communicated in frightened whispers now skipped through sun-dappled rooms, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. The house that had stood as a monument to grief now vibrated with the melodies of children's songs and impromptu dance parties. "Higher, Mama Mary, higher." Emily would squeal as Mary Johnson lifted her toward the ceiling, their shadows dancing across walls that had witnessed too much sorrow. The bond between them had deepened beyond words, transcending the circumstances that had brought them together. Each night, Emily fell asleep cradled in Mary's arms, her tiny fingers often clutching Mary's sleeve as if to ensure she wouldn't disappear. The nightmares that had once plagued her sleep had gradually subsided, replaced by peaceful dreams and the occasional giggle that bubbled up even in slumber. Mary would sit there, sometimes for hours, watching over the child who had claimed her heart, humming lullabies her own mother had once sung. John Smith, too, had undergone a transformation that surprised even himself. The man who had once micromanaged every aspect of his business empire now found himself building precarious pillow forts in the living room and laughing when they collapsed. He had traded boardroom presentations for bedtime stories, discovering joy in the imperfection of family life. "I never thought I'd see you covered in finger paint," Frank Brown remarked one afternoon, finding John in his study with colorful smudges on his formerly immaculate dress shirt. "Neither did I," John replied with a smile that reached his eyes, something that hadn't happened in years. The businessman who had once ruled his domain with icy distance now embraced the beautiful chaos of their unconventional family. Dinner conversations were no longer stilted affairs, but lively exchanges punctuated by Emily's enthusiastic interruptions. Even Eleanor, during her increasingly frequent visits, seemed softened by the warmth that had permeated the once cold mansion. John often found himself pausing in doorways, watching Mary and Emily together, reading, playing, or simply existing in comfortable silence. In those moments he felt the weight of his grief lifting, replaced by something he hadn't dared hope for, a second chance at happiness. "We're making new memories," Mary told him one evening as they sat on the patio overlooking the garden Frank had helped restore, not to replace the old ones but to build alongside them. John nodded, understanding finally that healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant finding the courage to love again. The evening light spilled through the tall windows of the Palo Alto mansion, painting everything in hues of amber and gold. Mary Johnson sat in the garden that she and Frank Brown had lovingly restored over the past months, watching as Emily played with her favorite stuffed animal. The once neglected space now bloomed with life, roses, Cuban trellises, lavender scenting the air, and butterflies dancing between flowers. Emily looked up from her game, her small face serious in the fading light. She crawled into Mary's lap, her tiny fingers tracing the outline of Mary's face with the innocent curiosity only a child could possess. "You're my mummy now, aren't you?" she whispered, hope trembling in her voice. Mary felt her heart expand in her chest, tears pricking at her eyes. She thought of all they had endured, the threats, the sabotage, the night her ex had broken in during the storm. She remembered Eleanor's cold disapproval that had slowly, remarkably, transformed into something like respect. She thought of John, watching them from his office window right now, his silhouette visible against the warm light inside. "Yes, sweetheart. I am," she answered, pulling the little girl close. From the doorway, John observed the two most important people in his world. The businessman who once measured success in dollars and deals now found wealth in these quiet moments. He stepped outside, joining them on the garden bench. "Daddy, Mary says she's my mommy now," Emily announced, her voice ringing with certainty. John smiled. The grief that had once etched deep lines in his face now softened. "She's been your mommy for a long time, hasn't she?" he said gently. Frank appeared with a tray of lemonade, his elderly hands steady as he set it down. "Beautiful evening," he remarked, his knowing eyes taking in the tableau before him. The family that had formed against all odds. Even Eleanor, visiting for the weekend, watched from the terrace, her usual rigid posture relaxed as she raised her glass in a silent toast. Later, as Mary tucked Emily into bed, the child drifted towards sleep with a contentment that had once seemed impossible. "Love you, Mama Mary," she murmured. "I love you too, my sweet girl," Mary whispered back. Downstairs, John waited in the living room, no longer the cold fortress it had once been. Photos now lined the walls. Emily's birthday, Mary's speech at the women's shelter, Frank teaching Emily to plant sunflowers. The mansion, once echoing with emptiness, now resonated with laughter and whispered secrets. As Mary descended the stairs, John reached for her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for making this a home again." And in that quiet moment, the mansion, once cold and silent, finally felt like home.